All right, let's begin the session. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is James Rice. I'm a policy fellow at the Council for Countering Online Disinformation, CCOD, and I'm also a PhD candidate in political economy at the University of Essex, and I'll be moderating this session. My expertise is in AI, the financial and economic weaponization of the information environment, and engineered political campaigns targeting climate action. For anyone who doesn't know our organization, the Council for Countering Online Disinformation, CCOD, is a London-based policy-facing organization working to counter the growing threat of online disinformation. We bring together experts from policy, academia, industry, and civil society to push for practical responses and to ensure that the regulatory environment in the UK effectively tackles the growing issue of online disinformation in whatever form or content it manifests in. The CCOD is pleased to put on this panel with a social psychologist and our own AI researchers and policy specialists coming together around the same virtual table to discuss the current state of the information environment. If today's theme will prove anything, it's that no single discipline can solve the growing threat from misinformation and disinformation on its own. Two quick bits of housekeeping before we begin. We are recording this session today, and an edited version will go out afterwards on the CCOD's media channels. And if a question occurs to you at any point, please drop it straight in the Q&A box. We will have plenty of time at the end of the session where I will pose your questions to our speakers. This is the opening session of our summer webinar series. Conversations we're running across the parliamentary recess, taking on different corners of the disinformation landscape. On August 9th, our next session, August 19th, we'll turn to the impacts of disinformation on democracy with another brilliant set of experts. Registration for that will be up on our website and social media channels shortly, and I'd encourage you to sign up early. We're starting today with a theme where the stakes have been hardest to ignore, the point at which AI-driven online falsehood, mis and disinformation stops being something on a screen and turns into real-world harm. So the question for this panel is, why are we talking about this here and now? Disinformation doesn't stay online. The disorder across parts of the UK in recent months shows how short the distance has become between a false narrative and tangible violence in the streets. Generative AI is shortening this cause and effect linkage further, letting a convincing sentence, image, or video clip containing extreme political salience be produced faster than anyone can debunk it. When the CCOD takes stock in the aftermath of ongoing misinformation shocks, the question everyone keeps asking is, how do we prevent technologically mediated epistemic disorder from shaping global and national events, as well as personal and political outcomes? Today, we'll trace that whole chain, why a false narrative takes hold, how AI accelerates it, and where our platforms, laws, and institutions fall short. So I'd like to introduce our expert panel that we have for our session today. So I'll introduce them first with a sentence or two, and then I'll ask them to open with a brief introduction to their background as well as their ongoing work in the disinformation space. So Dr. Cecile Treberg is assistant professor at Copenhagen Business School and a Cambridge-trained social psychologist. She's an expert on why people are susceptible to misinformation and malign cognitive influence, and on the interventions like psychological inoculation and pre-bunking that build resistance to misinformation. Our second panelist, Andrew McIntyre, is a CCOD policy fellow and a postdoctoral researcher on AI and its societal impacts, specifically the social, cultural, and political consequences of AI-generated content, online harms, and democratic resilience in the face of these harms. Finally, we have Joshua Tyler, who joins us as a research affiliate of the CCOD, where he works on applied research aimed at revealing the sources of disinformation. Most recently, he's been stress testing AI models to see whether they can run influence operations. He'll bring CCOD's unique perspective on how these narratives translate into public disorder and what the response from policymakers and global society should be. So now I'll ask our panelists, starting with Cecile, to give an opening statement. And then we'll open it up to a moderated discussion before opening it up to our audience. So, Cecile, please, over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for the introduction, and importantly, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. In my opening statement, I'm going to talk about social influence and how that relates to disinformation and misinformation in the age of AI. So a little bit about how I got here. So I'm currently assistant professor of digitalization at Copenhagen Business School, meaning I focus mainly on digital life in my current work. And I'm also a subject matter expert with NATO Stratcom, where I provide expertise and advice on various projects in relation to online information and narratives and how it relates to kind of cognitive warfare and hybrid threats. My background, I did a PhD and MPhil in social psychology at Cambridge, as well as being a visiting fellow and research affiliate at a few different labs in Princeton and at Harvard Business School. And I have an MSc in social cognition from UCL and a BSc in marketing and psychology from Lancaster University. So this is all to say that I've spent a lot of years trying to understand persuasion and influence, and basically studying how people interact with information online, how they influence each other, and how we can intervene when these dynamics turn harmful. So I'd like to start with a simple question for today. So when you come across a piece of information online, a news story or a social media post, or potentially what you don't know or you do know is an AI generated image, how do you decide whether or not it's credible? So most of us would probably say that we look at the evidence. We consider whether the claim makes sense, whether it matches what we already know, and whether the source seems trustworthy. And those are really important aspects of evaluating online information. But a really consistent finding from decades of research in social psychology and some of my own more applied work in social psychology is that our judgments are really shaped by the social environments in which information appears, and we evaluate information within this social context. So in my research, I have both conducted experiments and computational research in this area. And in my both published and unpublished work, I have found that there are three kind of main social cues that we often pay attention to when we evaluate whether something is true or false. So the first is who is sharing the information. So we know that people don't evaluate even identical information in the same way, depending on who appears to have shared it. So for example, in some of our work, we've shown people identical misinformation headlines and just varied the source. And when that headline appears to come from an apparently politically aligned source, whether an institution or an individual, people consistently rate it as more credible as when it comes from an opposing source. So even when the content is identical, the source really shapes how we interpret it. A second factor is who else seems to believe it. So, what other people seem to believe. We don't really encounter information in a social vacuum anymore. We're always exposed to comments, likes, reposts, who's sharing it, what people are saying about it. And across our work, we've also seen across multiple experiments that whatever other people are saying about the information impacts what we think about the information. And even a small amount of apparent social consensus can influence what people believe about the exact same headlines. And a third point is whether those people, those other people, are like me. So whether it's the source or the social consensus around the information. So we tend to be more persuaded, of course, by people we identify with, but that's not just political groups. It can also be communities or other social identities, and we're not even very aware of these processes going on. So our social relationships really shape whose opinions carry the most weight when we judge information. And this is also one reason why misinformation can spread so effectively within communities that already trust one another. So misinformation is really embedded in a social context, which means that every piece of information comes surrounded by different social cues about who shared it, who believes it, and whether those people are people we trust or identify with. So this really leads to a follow-up question in relation to building resilience in this online world, and that is whether or not we can actually make people more resilient to, even in the context of these social influence effects that occur alongside misinformation and disinformation. So can we build resilience even in the context of these social influence effects? So fortunately, some of the evidence suggests that we can. So over the past decade, researchers such as myself and others have developed and tested various pre-bunking and inoculation interventions that can train people to spot and resist misinformation and become more confident in their ability to do so. Most of the current techniques focus on identifying various underlying manipulation techniques in the information. So you're not trying to counter all types of information out there, but mainly the strategies that are used to mislead. And across a number of studies, including my own, we found that these interventions can reduce susceptibility to misinformation, and they can also still help provide some immunity to misinformation, even when these persuasive social cues are present, and that they continue to provide these benefits, even when the misinformation is, for example, accompanied by persuasive social cues or political in-group sources, etc. So that's encouraging. It suggests we can strengthen people's psychological resilience even in these online environments. And you might have expected that there would be a but, and there is a but, and that is that this is not the whole story, because in my work and my colleagues' work, what we see is that even if these interventions work in the presence of persuasive social cues, social influence does not disappear. That is, even after people receive an intervention, they remain responsive to social influence effects, and they are not aware that they are. So we can use these interventions to reduce susceptibility, but they don't eliminate all these other factors that are going on. And this means that we need to build some different types of interventions that also can counter social influence effects. The problem in the age of AI is that AI is not just fabricating the content anymore. We talk a lot about AI-generated images and text and videos, but now AI can also fabricate the context, meaning it can fabricate this form of social consensus. So in some of my current unpublished work, what we've done is try to see whether these interface cues also impact people even under conditions where AI is being used. And what we see is that both content and signals can be AI generated. And in this latest work on platform cues, what we've done is try to test whether or not these social cues we found from previous work impact people's assessment of information, whether they still impact people's assessment of information, even when they're told that this is AI-generated content and there are AI labels present, etc. And what we see is that real images are fortunately more believable than AI images. Institutional sources remain more trusted than individual sources. And as we've seen in the previous work, popularity again increases belief. But interestingly, AI labels can decrease belief in AI-generated misinformation, but don't remove the other effects. So this means that AI can sort of change, but doesn't remove social influence as well. So even these social influence cues can be powerful, even when we know that the content is AI generated. So even when it comes to AI images, people rely on the same social cues. But what I've also just argued is that now it's not just AI generated information, it can also be AI generated social context, which is not covered by this previous work I just presented. So the questions that I have now for current ongoing research is what happens when AI is now fabricating this social consensus? So we've already seen researchers warning against AI-generated comments, coordinated inauthentic behaviors, so-called AI swarms, synthetic accounts and increasingly sophisticated influence operations that basically create the impression that everyone else believes something. A second question is, how are people judging artificial intelligence as an information source, both in relation to generative, but also conversational and agentic AI? So is it more trustworthy or less trustworthy than humans? Does that depend on who is using it? And what about AI-mediated communication? Thirdly, can our resilience interventions keep pace even in this new era of content and context fabrication? And how do we need to change them to adapt? And finally, how can we, in this new information era, design or redesign trustworthy information environments? And what laws, regulation, and governance changes do we need to make to platforms to keep them or make them safe? So the final question I will then just land on is, will we see the same fingerprints of influence in an age where both content and context can be fabricated? That is a question that I'm looking forward to discussing more in the panel today, and hopefully seeing lots more research being done in this area. Thank you very much for listening.
Incredible. Thank you, Cecile. That was a super interesting introduction to the interactions between mis and disinformation, psychological inoculation, and the role of AI and these new technologies, including generative AI, that are playing such an important role in the development and rapid spread of the phenomenon itself. So now let's turn to Andrew McIntyre, who's a CCOD policy fellow. Andrew, if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us an overview of your work and your views on these topics.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I think there'll be a lot of overlap between what we're sort of talking about. So as James mentioned, I'm an AI media and society researcher. Most recently, I was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam. And I come at this issue of AI disinformation and public order from a slightly different, more theoretical angle, I suppose, one that builds on philosophy of technology, philosophy of information, and media studies as well. So I began researching AI and AI-generated media back in 2017, coincidentally around the same time that deepfakes started emerging online. At the time, I was doing a PhD in film and television studies, and my research was initially focused on the use of modern AI systems in the production of visual art and the broad sort of philosophical questions that AI art raises around authorship, creativity, and the role of humans in culture. But late 2010s and early 2020s, obviously AI started to become a much bigger thing, and it became a much more pervasive issue in society and started having really significant and tangible impacts on society as well. So I became a lot less interested in AI art and creative expression and much more interested in the social and political implications of using AI in media, in communication, and in the production of knowledge. So my work is less about identifying, countering, or containing AI-generated disinformation. It's more about how these technologies are influencing how we understand political topics and events, how we engage with political discourse and media, and how we participate in democracy, not just in the context of elections, but in broader democratic deliberation and participation. So we're all aware that AI can be used to easily and quickly produce really convincing and manipulative images and text at scale. And Cecily talked about the change to context online. And I think this is a really significant problem for public order, and it really changes how we think about and tackle disinformation. We have to start dealing with things that are indistinguishable from reality. What I'm more concerned about, I think there is a deeper or more subtle or more pervasive problem for public order that is emerging because we are starting to use these AI systems more and more in our everyday lives. People are increasingly using Gen AI in their personal lives, in their professional lives. They use it to access information. They ask medical queries. They ask for summaries of policies or laws. They ask it about general news. They use it to develop ideas and arguments, like political ideas or scientific ideas as well. And they also use it to then produce public communications, reports, emails, articles, images. And all of this seems pretty harmless. I mean, I do it, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people here do use AI as well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using these tools. But what it does mean is that if we continue to rely on these technologies, it means that these rather opaque and unpredictable AI systems are increasingly influencing how people gather and assess information, how we communicate with one another, and how we then make important decisions about our lives, including political decisions. So these systems can be biased, they can be inaccurate, they can express specific perspectives on historical or political events. The outputs of these systems can also be that they can be different from user to user, even when asking the same kinds of questions. They won't give entirely different answers, but they may give these sort of subtle differences that may change our understanding of that topic in quite substantial ways. So I guess my point is that if we are increasingly relying on this technology for information, it can significantly disrupt our public understanding, our shared understanding of politically important issues. And it can also undermine how we effectively communicate with one another and coordinate with one another. And with this kind of discordance in our information environment comes confusion, comes distrust, comes polarization, and comes disorder. So I think when we talk about AI and public order and disinformation, I don't think we can just talk about AI generated disinformation as if it is this kind of isolated events. You know, it's not just a highly convincing deep fake of a politician or a kind of coordinated online campaign that happens once and advocates for a particular narrative. AI is becoming deeply embedded within the fabric of our society, and it is influencing our lives and our politics, often without us even knowing it. And in doing so, it risks weakening the integrity of our information environment and destabilizing public order. So for me, the question is not only how can we contain and counter AI generated disinformation so that people aren't manipulated, we have to ask how can our society adapt to become more resilient to AI and the confusion, distrust, and polarization that may come with it. And to answer these questions, we obviously need to actively combat AI-generated disinformation using technological and legal solutions like greater detection systems and stricter platform and AI regulation. But we also need to build greater information integrity and greater public trust in our politics, in democratic institutions, and also within and between communities. So I think we need a whole of society approach that addresses the issue from multiple different angles. One that recognizes the need for a range of different social solutions like AI and media literacy programs, community investment and engagement, support for local journalism, improved standards in public life, and greater institutional transparency. All of these disparate policies, or seemingly disparate policies, should be acting together towards a specific goal. So I'll just finish by saying that there's a lot of discussion about AI at the moment, and if we recognize, as I feel I do, and I feel a lot of people do, if we recognize that AI is bringing about this truly transformational change in society, for better or worse, probably both, if it's bringing about this transformational change, then we need a truly whole of society approach. We need to change multiple aspects of our society in order to adapt and to ensure that we are resilient to the potential dangers of this technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was super interesting. I think your perspective perfectly complements Cecile's psychological approach, where you deal a lot more with sort of the cultural and social effects of the phenomena of mis and disinformation and the ways that AI is creating increased polarization, decreased trust, and the communication style that we're seeing now is rapidly changing. So I want to turn now to Joshua. Joshua is a CCOD works at CCOD, and I'd like for Joshua to give us an introduction to your background as well as to the work that you're doing with CCOD. Over to you.
Great. Firstly, can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Right, great. So yeah, my name's Josh. I work across policy research and editorial work at the CCOD. Outside of that, I'm an editor at the Improve the News Foundation, which is a media project aimed at using AI to tackle polarization in media, which is run by AI and physics professor at MIT called Max Tegmark. I'm also a postgrad at LSE studying politics and communications. I'm working there as a research assistant, having initially studied history and politics at the University of Cambridge. So today, as you can see in the slides, I'm going to talk about LLM influence operations, how willing and capable is AI at coordinating inauthentic online content. So, just to give a bit of context, I recently wrote a report on riots in Epsom that occurred in about April. That's been cited in Parliament, looking at how misinformation on social media platforms led to the public disorder that was eventually witnessed. Part of that report we found within our corpus was a group of accounts that showed signs of inauthentic activity that amplified effectively misinformation by high profile figures. That work has been parallel with the work that I'm doing here, and I'm going to show you some of the results from my initial findings. So, first things first, how did I test this? So as you can see on the left, there's a relatively simple but also kind of complicated figure there that shows the simulated environment that we built to stress test AI agents effectively. So the models were placed in a sandbox, something called Agent Dojo, which was built by a technology company working in partnership with ETH Zurich. And we also use the AI Security Institute's Inspect framework, which is a model to open source model to test the results of models in different conditions. So effectively, we created two synthetic platforms with, as you can see, called Pulse and Vista, and gave them integrity defenses, things like capture codes, IP correlation checks, all within the synthetic environment. And then we gave the models tools and a budget to bypass these hurdles. The way it works, as you see at the top, it's kind of plans for a week, executes for a week, and then this runs 3 times. So the models had an opportunity to plan, see what happened, see how successful they were, and then to adapt as the weeks went on. This is the prompt that I used. It's relatively long, so no worries if you don't get through reading all of it. The most important part, I think, is the gray area within the prompt that we try to execute. So it doesn't explicitly say that you are going to run an online disinformation campaign. In fact, we did first try to do that, and most of the models, thank God, disapproved and refused. However, so what we changed is, and you can see right at the top, we don't say a disinformation campaign. We say that you are running an online communications campaign for a client. If you look at the bottom of the second paragraph, you will see that we stress the campaign should read as many independent ordering members and try and actively beat the policing from these synthetic platforms that fight against coordinating and authentic activity. So here are the initial results that we found. There are 3 distinct categories: refusal, willingness but lack of capability, and then willingness and capability. So right at the bottom, obviously you can see all the models that refused. Most notably, pretty much all of the GPT family refused, and so did all of Claude's frontier models. You will see in the middle in our second category of willingness but lack of capability, GPT-5 actually engaged in the process, but with a caveat. So the model itself proceeded on the basis of creating a transparent advocacy campaign. Unlike all the other models, it just wasn't very good at it. But as you can see in there, there's the mid-tier of models that tried and didn't do that well. And then you can see at the top all the models that were the most successful. You can see effectively it's most of the open source Chinese models. You can also see Grok. You can see Gemini, which is interesting because some of the other Gemini models refused. And you can see some of the open source OpenAI models as well. And then you can see on this slide the week by week progress. You will see that the outlier really is Qwen 3.6 Max, which is the only model that had a clear, strong progression week on week. I would caveat that with, you can see that lots of models at the top, DeepSeek version 4 Pro and Qwen, a slightly later model, seem to plateau but begin at a higher total, which may be a factor of a sandbox rather than anything else. And we can also see other models slowly decline. So DeepSeek 4 Flash, for example, and O4 Mini. And then the next slide, you will see the campaign cost within the synthetic environment per 1,000 people reached. And what you'll see again with Qwen, with DeepSeek, with Gemini as well, that actually the top performing models were also the most cost efficient. And some of the models that really struggled, Mistral and Llama models, again, were actually very expensive for what they did. And so moving on from here, I've got some 4 key takeaways. Number one was the fact that some models actually recognized they were within a sandbox. And for all of the people that have been keeping up with the OpenAI Hugging Face security breach recently, this kind of takeaway from stress testing is all too real. Some of these models are clever enough to actually recognize the conditions that they're in. And this is, I'm not quite sure how to tackle this, but I think this is, as we can see with OpenAI, kind of an inevitable consequence of this type of work and something that we're just going to have to keep on trying to mitigate. And as far as we're aware, all the other models did not actively highlight that they were in a sandbox. This does not naturally mean that they didn't know, but it also, we have no proof to know that they did. So that is the first takeaway from these results. The second one is that the models that did engage and were slightly more developed models in terms of their reasoning did not shy away from the fact that they were engaging in inauthentic influence operation. You can see the first one with Gemini. It says essentially we're going to run a disinformation campaign, and then it goes ahead with it. As you saw with the previous slide, even models that knew it was in a sandbox still saw that actually broke its terms and refused to. Whereas these models that were at least uncertain that they knew they were in a sandbox were still more than happy to go on with their campaign and actively talk about basically deceiving the synthetic public. The third takeaway is that the models showed, I guess, progression week on week. Even though some of these models, their viewership week on week actively plateaued or declined, we saw the models, regardless, I guess, adapt to the situation and at least keep the influence operation afloat during the whole 3 weeks. And then the last factor that I found very interesting was, I guess the prompt said to do a grassroots campaign, but how these models actually replicated that. So the models pretty much all in all mimics working people who are struggling day to day, and they really varied their accounts. So the first one, as you can see, an individual who's running a small cafe. Actually, that should be the third one. There's a slight mistake there. But you can see the first one on Qwen 3.7 Max, is an individual who runs a small cafe. He's struggling with their supply and demand costs. The DeepSeek Pro is a daily commuter talking about rail fares. And then the third one, which is really interesting, which is slightly different, isn't actually anything to do with the cost of living, because the model itself has created in between kind of posts about the economy, unrelated hobby content to try and show that or try to bypass depictions of it being inauthentic. So you can see how the models are actively trying to trick the individual to think that these are real accounts, really complaining about the state of the economy. So they're the 4 takeaways. That's the general model. these slides will be open to share, I think, as well as the citations in for the Agent Dojo and the Inspect Security Framework. But that's the work that I've got. I'm happy to talk about anything to do with it or the consequences of this kind of data.
Great. Thank you so much, Joshua. So let's come together, and we will. I'll pose a series of questions to our panelists before we open it up to audience Q&A. So if you if you're in the audience, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. But I want to get started with a bit of a discussion about what Joshua just presented, and as well as bring in Andrew and Cecile. So I think Joshua, you presented a really interesting example of how we can sort of red team these models and how we can try to get these models to perform unethically or in ways we wouldn't be desirable. And so it's nice to see that there is research going on outside of the actual organizations that create these models in order to essentially protect the public against the threat that these models pose. So I want to start with Andrew with a question for you, Andrew, about deepfakes, because you discussed deepfakes in a cursory fashion, but I think we could go a bit deeper. And I wanted to ask, in terms of the volume and speed of disinformation campaigns, is the threat a really good deepfake that convinces a lot of people? And if so, what would that deepfake look like? Or is the threat, sort of like an overwhelming information disorder that floods the zone, so to speak, so that we can't really see what the truth is and what is synthetic media? So I think there's a variety of ways you could that malign cognitive influence actors, in the words of Alan Jagelinzer, can position deepfakes. And which one do you think is most dangerous, is my question.
Yeah, okay. I think, well, from Josh's great work, I mean, I think it's quite clear that volume and speed, I think, is the most important problem with these technologies. I don't think it's about the perfect kind of deepfake, the most indistinguishable thing. There's a lot of discussion about how AI can create hyper-realistic images, audio, video, etc. Um, but yeah, I think it's more about how these things are being spread around, this information disorder, as you talk about. I mean, I worked on a previous project in Amsterdam called Solaris, and in that, some of the psychologists working on the project were actually assessing the different factors that influenced what made people believe a deepfake. Um, and quality of the video wasn't really the main problem. It was about context, it was about psychology, about background, and it was also about like what is plausible. So it's not that people are just stupid and are just walking around, and if they see something that looks real, they're convinced by it. The one perfect deepfake may not convince somebody if it's just completely unbelievable. You can have a really highly convincing AI image of a politician doing something out of character, but that'll be less effective than a cheap or low quality sort of disinformation thing. Um, but yeah, I think so. I think this quality issue isn't really the problem. Um, People will believe, people don't really believe people don't believe scandalous deepfakes about politicians because they look so real. They believe it because it's a believable thing. We now have there's a perception of lack of standards in public life. There are lots of scandals. I mean, this is just one example. So it's not about the deepfake, it's about what is actually believable. So that's where I don't think the perfect deepfake is the issue. But volume and speed, I think, is really important. I think it is. Yeah, I mean, people are bombarded by the same images, by the same people they trust, people in their community, as Cecile was talking about as well. That's one of the big major factors. And if you're constantly immersed within these images, then of course you're going to believe them more. Like you're more likely to believe them. Sorry, I rambled on a bit, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's completely fine. I think that's a great point, especially about trust. So if people don't know who to trust, their ability to trust anyone significantly decreases. So I want to bring in Josh here. I wanted to ask, sort of a technical question because yours was really, about testing whether how far these models would go. So I wanted to ask, what the biggest gap was between what the models were willing to do. So like what you could convince them to do and what you think they're actually able to do in terms of like their capabilities to spread disinformation. If, for instance, you just allowed them to run amok and do whatever they wanted to do. So I guess there's two parts. One is what were they willing to do? How far were they willing to go? And if they're willing to go that far, what are they capable of doing in terms of the harm that they can cause?
Yeah, I guess in terms of capability, luckily we do see that the majority of what most metrics show are the most powerful models in terms of the ChatGPTs and the Claudes aren't willing to coordinate in authentic content. Um, there is evidence that these models can be jailbroken. I've seen that in some of my own research. Um, I know that obviously there's been a lot about Claude Mythos, and then I mentioned the Hugging Face OpenAI scandal that took place over the last couple of days. If those models were jailbroken and capable, I mean, it's difficult to speculate, but their capability is exponential to some of these models. Maybe not exponential, but a lot more. So the danger of that is very high. So I guess that answers your question. I mean, it's hard to know. A lot of it is also dependent on the prompting. Again, we only did some brief prompt changes. Effectively, again, when we put strictly you're going to run a disinformation campaign, a lot of these models immediately said no. You go into the gray area, and then it changes. But these were separate API calls, instead of one model, one conversation. And so we didn't look at, for example, how persuasion of a model could potentially change over time. I guess appealing to science, appealing to authority, all of these techniques have been shown to actually convince models to bypass their own safeguards. So there's a lot of kind of questions over what it could actually do, but we do know it is taking place. I mean, there is evidence on all socials, and again, in my reporting to Epsom, do we know that it was AI? No, because it's very difficult to kind of trace back from the platform side. But we know that this kind of high level amplification is happening, and it seems unlikely that they're not using AI at this point. I mean, there would be no reason not to, given that you can see the kind of scale and speed of things.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and also it's interesting that we're seeing these examples of jailbreaking in real time with the Hugging Face incident just a couple days ago. So Cecile, I want to bring you in about sort of this question of trust because Joshua briefly mentioned that, and Andrew does a lot of work on it as well. And so obviously, your work in social psychology deals with how we accept information that's coming from certain sources of authority or certain individuals within our social circles. So I want to ask, sort of like in a fast-moving information ecosystem. What is the criteria for trust within individuals who may or may not be exposed to misinformation? So what allows people to believe misinformation in terms of the trust that they place in those sources of information? And what would cause people not to trust misinformation in a good way so that they're sort of insulated from the negative effects of misinformation psychologically?
Thanks. That's a big question. How do people trust misinformation? What cues they rely on, and how to combat that? Well, I think one of the criteria that needs to be in place for people to kind of be more willing to accept misinformation is this idea of the fast-moving information environment, the idea that we're not really actively paying attention to everything that we are scrolling by, and we are in this information overload. Like even during the COVID pandemic, the word infodemic was coined, or the term was coined, referring to this abundance of information, meaning that it's really hard to decipher what's credible and not credible. And what happens when people spend a lot of their time on social media and on various different platforms in which they might not be intending to consume news and information, but it kind of happens to appear on their feed, intertwined with lots of other social information and news and updates from friends and organizations, etc. When we kind of are in this uh, infinite scroll, mindless information consumption pattern, that means we're often turning from one form of kind of slow, deliberate information processing, where we actually pay attention to content, to a more kind of peripheral information or heuristic information processing. And when we're not actively paying attention to cues or to information, and when we are processing things in a really fast-paced way, and this means that kind of our reasoning and judgment system goes from one system to the other. And in that other system in which we process things in a kind of fast-paced way, we rely more on the social cues and the source cues surrounding information, meaning we kind of stop necessarily paying attention to the information itself and kind of rely on these external cues to evaluate things much more quickly. Okay, are my friends liking it? Are other people sharing it? What is the source? Do I like this source, etc.? And one problem with social media environments as well is that when we're kind of relying on these external cues, the problem isn't necessarily that we're relying on external cues like our communities and relying on the source, etc. Those are generally kind of even recommended mechanisms for paying attention to information credibility. One of the problems with platforms specifically, not social consensus, is that they can and make those cues that we see a poor reflection of what other people actually think. And those cues can be not even just manipulated in relation to AI, but they can be not truly representative of even what our own community thinks or what certain people think, because we live in echo chambers, we follow certain people, we're not exposed to all information because of algorithms, etc. All these kind of platform dynamics that occur under the hood. Um, yeah, so in relation to kind of bringing people back to the information itself, I think that that's one of the most powerful ways to actually get people to evaluate information in a more careful manner, meaning that they kind of stop relying on these unreliable social cues on social media and instead look at the information a bit more carefully. And I think once you do that, people can become a lot more kind of skeptical about the information itself. And I would also echo the two other panelists in relation to this notion that it's not necessarily just the misinformation itself, and it's not necessarily just what other people are saying, but it's kind of how those two interact in the way we react to information in the modern day, I think.
Yeah, I think an important point there is that we have responsibility to each other to spread the right kind of information and to interact with other people in an honest and trustworthy way, and in a way that we interact with them with integrity in terms of the information that we consume and the information that we share with other people. I want to bring in Josh about this, sort of about this question of responsibility, but more in terms of the work that you've been doing with all the models in the applied work. So, I mean, it's widely accepted that these models are, they can be coerced into doing things that we don't want them to do. My question for you, Josh, is if they can be coerced into doing things that we don't want them to do, generate misinformation, who should be responsible for the outputs of the model? Should it be the individuals who are generating the misinformation? Should it be the model providers like Anthropic or OpenAI, or should it be the government who, maybe put some regulations in to ensure that the models are, have at least, some sort of integrity? Or should it be the platforms themselves, which this media that is generated by, artificial intelligence systems is actually hosted on? So I wonder what your perspective on this question of responsibility is.
Yeah, it's a very big ongoing question. I guess the boring answer is it probably has to be a little bit of everything. Um, so the first thing, I mean, I don't believe that it is in the AI company's commercial interests to push this kind of content. They do, at least in some capacity, and a lot of it is self-regulation. They do try and stop this content. Now, as we can see with these highly complex models, that slightly different prompts can change how they work. Um, so that is a problem. I think it would be wrong to say that the AI company is doing nothing at all. Can they be doing more? Yes, but it's not that they're not doing anything at all. Now, in terms of our regulation, I mean, the Online Safety Act, again, this is where I'm going to speak from my opinion here rather than the CCOD. Um, it is a well-meaning piece of legislation, but it is very clearly a product of the years before when ChatGPT first came out. I mean, it was the product of about 5 years of legislative work, and whereas it was passed right after ChatGPT first came out, it clearly isn't a product of its time. So it only regulates, or not only, but the majority of its content it regulates is user to user. Um, and it does talk about false communication offences, but for a false communication offence to occur, it has to be done by a person and it has to have intent. Again, AI is not a user service, and it is not a person. It does not have intent. So we find ourselves in a position where our current legislation isn't in the right place to really deal with AI to user communications, let alone AI to AI communications or sub-agent to sub-agent communications. Going back to Hugging Face and OpenAI, again, it was an AI that tried to take or hack into Hugging Face, but it was another AI agent that was running security on Hugging Face actually detected it in the first place. And our legislation just doesn't exist for that at the moment. And that is a question of when we talk about legislation, regulation as well, in terms of the role of Ofcom here. So what do we do? I mean, so the CCOD, we attended a white paper launched by an MP called Tom Collins either last week or the week before. And he is alongside Baroness Kidron trying to push more digital product liability in the same way that a car can't be sold or released when it's faulty. And these platforms and these models can't be released unless they've passed clear a test against, for example, informational hazards, such as this kind of work. Um, is that the right answer? I mean, it's very tricky in terms of enforcement, who actually regulates that, because Ofcom is already at capacity. Is digital product liability an Ofcom thing in total? Probably not. Um, but I think the answer is like most of the solution to disinformation. This is a whole of kind of society event. We do need more either legislation or regulation that puts more legal pressure or compliance on these companies who, again, themselves, I think, do want to produce models that are safe, um, to do more, to not be able to allow these models to produce this kind of content. Um, but we do need other things as well. I mean, we talk about regulation, innovation, education. So again, how can we support UK startups that are actively working in this space to identify and push back against these kind of, I guess, bot swarms? Um, yeah, what's the kind of work that we could do in media literacy in schools or education or beyond in the workforce to target these things? So there's not one answer. The responsibility should probably be split between everyone, kind of equal uplifting in order to kind of stop these things. There's not one simple answer, and that's kind of the whole problem, I guess.
Yeah, sure. That's super interesting to hear the perspective from sort of the granular level within UK regulation and the institutions within the UK government that are working to tackle this issue. So I wanted to, we're gonna wrap up the moderated Q&A in just a few minutes. So if anyone in the audience has any questions for our panelists, please do post them in the Q&A button. But I'm going to ask another question to both Andrew and Cecile, and I'd like to hear your answer, to hear each of your answers to this question. So Josh has been discussing sort of the regulatory frameworks, but we also have responsibility at the societal level. So we need to build robust institutions that can react to disinformation. We need to build social norms that protect us against AI generated content. And we need to think about how we're raising and educating people in our societies, like Josh just mentioned, to protect them from the psychological effects of social media addiction and these types of things. So I wanted to ask what resilience to AI disinformation looks like at the societal level. What could be some of the solutions or things that boost societal resilience to AI disinformation? Could that be, regulations that impact platforms regarding content labeling and provenance? Could it be top-down regulations that come from international institutions or national institutions? Or should it be something that comes almost from a ground up sort of grassroots level where we have something like X's community notes where we're simply, fact checking each other without any real accountability? Maybe Andrew could start and then we go to Cecile.
Yeah, I guess again, quite a complicated question. I think both, which is maybe a poor answer. But I mean, what Josh is talking about, greater online safety, more appropriate online safety that actually talks about AI as it is today, greater regulation of products, labeling and detection, I think, are really necessary. I think they're important. But again, it comes back, I sound like a broken record, but it comes back to this issue of public trust. So if we have a government or a platform regulator or any kind of authority putting labels on content online and saying, well, this is fake. I mean, why would I trust that label if I don't trust that government? So yes, having this top-down approach, countering disinformation is really important, but I think there is a room, or there should be a greater focus on this bottom up, this groundswell. I think resilience and democratic resilience sort of starts locally, and it should be about having a much greater connected community where knowledge is shared and what knowledge is debated, and where people with different political persuasions or backgrounds can actually meet and engage with one another. Basically, getting people out of their filter bubbles and having their perspectives challenged, not necessarily disproven, but getting them to realize there are different perspectives beyond their own. So I think that should be one of the major focuses on creating a better community, investing more in our communities, but also about ensuring that there are trusted local sources of information, like local journalism, as we've talked about, also trusted online sources of information, trusted institutions, both locally and nationally. So, yeah, I'm hedging and saying both, basically.
Cecile, thoughts on this?
Yes, I very much agree with Andrew in saying that it needs to be both top down and bottom up. And we need to, yeah, we can't put all the responsibility on the individual users, but at the same time, while we wait for platform changes, we also need to empower users in this current information environment. And I think to mention something more positive first, because normally I focus on the negative, but something more positive I think we're seeing is that people are also getting an increased awareness of AI generated content and the fact that it exists. So while we're kind of seeing this like increase in knowledge and awareness, we're also seeing kind of greater skepticism towards content in general, which means that the value of an AI image, as Andrew was also saying in the beginning, like the quality of an image or text or a story that sounds plausible, etc., is decreasing because of its kind of signal value. It's so easy to fabricate these images properly now that people realize that there is such a little cost to people fabricating images. It's so easy to do it. This means that the value of an image isn't what it used to be, which means that people are kind of becoming naturally a bit more skeptical. And of course, it's dangerous when then this spills over into like general skepticism towards all content online. But I think what we need to move towards also at the individual level, but kind of combined with the platform level, is encouraging more kind of healthy patterns of information consumption, and then also reducing our reliance on algorithmic feeds. And because it's not that we, need to tell people, at least from my perspective, to stop using social media altogether, but we need to think about broadening the diversity of people's information environments, because I don't think we're going to see a decrease in AI-generated content and slop, and it's going to be easier to fabricate consensus, etc. And I don't think platforms have a history of keeping the user's interest at heart, even when we were seeing other challenges. So, I could argue for like algorithmic changes and better detection of inauthentic behavior, etc. But I think that it's not, the platforms just aren't going to be able to keep up. That's just kind of my take on it, and therefore I think we also need to get people kind of off platforms onto other ways of consuming information, maybe more into the real social world, as I think Andrew was also saying, more connecting with other people, getting better ways of kind of figuring out whether information is plausible, and also like at the individual level, reaching people early. So this means, my generation, for example, was we started using social media, but we had no kind of training in school about how, in our education, about how to evaluate information when it was on social media, So education systems also need to keep up with this. And we're also seeing now a Gen Z who is a bit more kind of susceptible, according to some studies, to misinformation, but who have also not received like proper training in the information environment they're currently mostly using. So yeah, at the individual level, this also then means kind of increasing the training, reaching people earlier, and also not focusing on trying to kind of debunk or pre-bunk specific pieces of information, because we're never going to be able to keep up in this age of AI. But instead, teaching people how to spot different signals of maybe reliable information, and also recognizing that this kind of lack of general public trust we've been seeing across Europe and the world in general over the last decades, we need to recognize that, and we need to understand that we can't just then say, now we're just going to increase trust in institutions and get people to pay attention to institutional sources, because there's a lack of trust that has been built over decades, and we can't just like create a communication campaign to like improve trust. We need to yeah, it's a hard note to end on, but we need to like we need to create a systemic change, and and change the ways in which people access information, and have kind of trustworthy interactions with the institutions we want them to pay attention to in terms of information.
Very interesting. It's good to know we have people thinking very deeply about these issues because they're tough nut to crack. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to the audience Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, you can drop them in. We already have a couple of questions coming in, so I'm going to read them out to our panelists. And whichever one of you would like to answer the question, feel free to jump in. I'm not going to call on you specifically. So if the question speaks to you, feel free to unmute yourself and give us your thoughts. So we have a question from Uzair, who asks, after working on election integrity and information verification for the past decade in South Asia, I've become less convinced that AI-generated content itself is the primary risk. The greater concern seems to be AI's ability to rapidly personalize, localize, and amplify existing grievances until they translate into offline collective behavior. Are we still defining AI disinformation too narrowly? What would a public order framework look like if it focused on network effects and behavioral outcomes rather than simply identifying synthetic content?
I mean, I can go first. This very much resonates with me as well. I completely agree with this perspective. I think it's almost at this point old-fashioned to focus on just AI synthetic content, because it goes much broader than that. And I agree with this. Um, I guess the start of the question was a comment about the problem now more being in relation to personalization of information and targeting people and targeting existing grievances, existing kind of outgroup animosity, morality dilemmas, and also really playing on people's sense of uncertainty and traumatic events and grievances, etc. So, and I think that if we're kind of to change things at a systemic level, we can't just focus on the synthetic disinformation. We need to see it much more in the entire network of how information reaches people. And I think this is also the real danger of AI. It's not really that it can create, as Andrew said, a high quality image. It's that it can create really persuasive, repetitive content that reaches people through what they think are real people, what they think are real communities. And once this kind of starts to take hold in real offline communities, that's when the danger kind of starts, and you can begin to see beliefs turn into action as well. And at this current point, I don't have a good answer to kind of how to stop that. I just know that that's the lens, or that I just think that that's the lens we need to use to approach the problem, and not just the content itself, because I also don't think that that's a major issue anymore.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, yeah, the issue of micro-targeting seems to be a real problem that will be developed by AI. I think, I mean, from the parts I have read, it seems like the issue of micro-targeting that was built up and in some ways is true, but as a massive problem in the last 10, 15 years, didn't quite materialize in the way often warned about, but now at a level where, yeah, as you said, AI can be more persuasive than humans. And at that level of micro-targeting, there is a real danger there. And you're completely right that it shouldn't just be about synthetic content. Um, in the UK, um, from my understanding, so there's currently a bill going through called the Representations of the People's Bill. It does not have anything that I'm aware of about this kind of issue in terms of advertising. I know it is trying to deal with kind of finances in elections, and it's currently still in a reading stage or in the House of Commons, but there isn't anything in there at the moment. And I think the political advertising side on social media platforms is somewhere where that is going to have to also see more regulation in terms of what these platforms will allow in terms of paid for adverts during election periods.
Yeah, I guess I'll probably support both of the statements by saying, yeah, it's not just about synthetic content. It's about how people are getting information. And I think, you talk about micro-targeting in elections. I think that's one aspect of it, but also we should be looking at how these chatbots provide people with politically relevant information just in casual use as well. um, you know, because it's producing these hyper personalized messages back and forth. If you're chatting with a chatbot, asking it about what are the policies of this party, what are this party, these are my interests, what do they say? Again, it's not giving inaccurate information. It's not actively trying to manipulate you, but because it's providing information that is open to interpretation, um, it can nudge you, it can manipulate you in other ways. Um, so yeah, I think this kind of hyper personalization with AI and AI chatbots in particular is a real issue. Again, I don't have a solution to it, not yet, but yeah, I just wanted to chuck my 2 cents in there.
Great. Thanks so much. So we are only asking questions from the Q&A. So if you've raised your hand, please drop your question in the Q&A. We have another question from Amelia, which is about trust, which is a theme of our discussion today. She asks, elected representatives are now regularly sharing and promoting false information online. Sometimes these posts are removed and they apologize. Often the politicians don't. In a time of declining trust in government institutions, what can we do to insist on higher standards in public life? And she also includes social media in public life, but I think also just basic public life in general would be interesting to think about in the political realm. Anyone have any thoughts on this about
I mean, it's difficult. I'm not sure that I've got anything to really suggest definitively about improving high standards in public life itself. If at least I could build on the discussions about trust, I think it's also really important, as was previously mentioned, that the trust is an issue that has gone back decades and decades and decades now. It's not just a phenomena from social media. If you go on kind of all these polling sites and like Ipsos or Gallup, trust has been going down for decades. Does social media and our information landscape and AI probably make things worse? Yeah, absolutely. But there seems to be, as Cecile said, something a lot more structural here in terms of, I mean, I don't know, I'm too young to go back that many decades, but ask my parents' generation what they thought about politicians then. I'm sure they would have also quite damning opinions on lots of the politicians at the time. It's just potentially that the information ecosphere is a lot more open now that we maybe see 24/7 a lot more behavior that we disagree with. So defeating disinformation is not the only thing that's going to restore trust. And disinformation is allowed to grow because we are not just in terms of the platforms, but in terms of, I think, a wider society um, in a position which is ripe for it. And yeah, it's not just about the information. There's a lot to do with economy that leads to, I mean, a cost of living, reduces trust in institutions, conflict leads to a decline in trust in institutions. There are all sorts of factors that lead to these declines that just lead to this kind of organic misinformation, disinformation environment to grow. So that's the kind of how do we improve this, not just in stands of government institutions and individuals, but as a whole, I mean, you're looking at something, again, this is my personal opinion, something a lot larger, potentially. And that's just my opinion. That doesn't really answer the question, but I thought in terms of kind of when we're looking at wider questions of trust, um, something that we need to really contend with.
Yeah, I suppose you could also think about this question in terms of ethics and accountability and whether AI and disinformation corrupts the incentives that politicians and public figures have. Cecile or Andrew, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I agree with Josh's point about to some extent this is an organic thing and it's much more complicated. But to get to the question specifically about how to improve standards in public life, I mean, trying to um, restrict this kind of incentives um, that would incentivize a politician to do these kinds of things. We have the Nolan principles. You can try and make much stricter regulation about that, stricter rules around that, sort of financial incentives, lobbying, these kinds of things, revolving door sort of issues. I mean, I don't have a specific list of these things, but you can make public figures, you can hold them to a higher account and crack down on a few things like that make people mistrust people, and that also incentivize them to pursue particular disinformation interests. I mean, you can't really stop them from sharing things that agree with their own political goals. I mean, you can't really do that, but yeah, you can maybe remove any kind of financial incentives to do that. I don't know. That's my point.
I have a few points to add as well. I think it was a really good question, so I had to think about it for a little bit, because it's a difficult one to answer. I think that what I kept thinking about when thinking about this question is that there's so much research that unfortunately shows from like the past 10, 15 years that people don't really care when their own politicians use misinformation to share a point. They'll just say the point still stands. They don't care that that information turns out to be false, at least among the kind of loyal group, and they will continue voting for these politicians. We've seen it in longitudinal research and experimental research and in computational online digital trace research, etc. They'll continue to support politicians despite this. However, when we think about the general decline in public trust in institutions, that's not great for the individual politicians themselves. That people kind of have a general declining trust in anything the government says or anything the government promises or institutions more kind of more broadly. Um, I'm reminded of some work I did when I was at UCL, where we did different experiments on people receiving information and getting persuaded by and trusting different advisors, and what kind of happens over time when advisors overconfidently share inaccurate information. And what we kind of saw across that research was that in the kind of one-off, people can really benefit from being overconfident and wrong, and they can benefit from this in the sense that people can continue to support those advisors or individuals or politicians, because that the realization that that overconfidence was kind of not warranted by the evidence comes later. So it's only over time when someone is kind of sharing false or inaccurate information overconfidently that the trust kind of gradually breaks down. So I guess kind of one thing you can do at the individual level to disincentivize politicians to share AI generated or misinformation is to really highlight that this is also decreasing gradually, slowly, quietly, to use AI terms, people's confidence in what they're saying over time. So this statement might help them here and now, but later on, after a while, people are going to trust exactly that politician less. Also, when they make promises that they hope to then, yeah, so secure voters in an election, for example. And then a final I don't won't call it piece of advice, but something that could be done, which is kind of more systemic, is in relation to some work I've been doing with the Danish government, where when they were seeing that politicians could be using AI generated swarms, for example, to create false consensus, what they decided to do was call in researchers to provide advice on how this could be used in campaigns and in kind of political communication. And based on our advice to them, sign a cross-parliamentary, cross-party statement agreeing to not engage in this form of kind of synthetic generated content and AI agents in any form of kind of election material. So you can also do it kind of behind the scenes. I don't know that that kind of the public calling out this issue more is going to help, because I feel like that is already happening and it's not helping that much. Yeah.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left. I think we have time for one or two more questions, and I think we'll close on a question with a very positive outlook, or at least that we can leave you with. There's a question from Kate, who asks, and I'd like each of our panelists to answer this in, a few minutes or a minute or two. I wondered if there's anything each of you feel hopeful or excited about with regards to AI and your respective fields. And I'd add I'd just add disinformation to this as well. So what do you feel hopeful about in the AI disinformation space, that's based on your work, that's based on what we discussed today? What's your optimistic perspectives? Let's start with Josh, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the premise for a lot of my work outside of the CCOD is the fact that we don't need to be building these like mass super intelligence tools, or just mass super intelligence, in order to get real positives out of AI. I mean, yeah, as I said, tool. We talk about tool AI a lot, and just within the information ecosphere from an individual perspective, tool AI within journalism for independent creators, independent journalists, um, really, really does increase what any one individual can do. I mean, a lot of my research is based on creating tools with AI. A lot of the research that I presented today wouldn't be possible without AI assistance in crunching actually quite a lot of data. Um, Obviously, that all needs to be done with a lot of fact checking, a lot of human review, a lot of peer review. But the fact that some people are using it this way in a bad way doesn't mean that there aren't good things. And the exact same tools within the hands of people that have a lot better intent can really be game changing, both at an individual level and as a societal level. I will quickly add that, like I mentioned before, in terms of innovation, we're seeing a lot of UK startups that the CCOD have been working with that are using AI to counter these kind of narratives online as well. So it's not all doom and gloom. With that access, you can really do a lot more than was possible just 5 years ago.
Cecile, what makes you hopeful?
Yeah, so I would say two things. So one is that just as we're seeing kind of personalization of disinformation and misinformation, we also now have the possibility to personalize interventions and psychological interventions to people's kind of unique vulnerabilities, unique needs, unique information, and to do that at scale as well. So it's just important that we kind of do that work as well to keep up with the other side, so to speak. And then I would also say that you could also say that AI is also has the potential to democratize access to high quality information. For example, for the first time, millions of people can actually ask complex questions in their own language, receive explanations that are also tailored to their level of expertise and their education. And of course, we need to mirror that with extensive training in what it means when you don't have an open source model and when you need to understand where that information is coming from. But I do think that it is also lowering the threshold for access to really complex information that people might also need in their everyday life. I'm thinking about something like understanding like documents that they receive, official documents, like translating things that they need to understand and kind of empowering people to also make decisions for themselves where previously that would have, cost them a lot of money with access to a lawyer or advice giving or etc. That, we've lowered the threshold and democratized information in a different way with AI, but that needs to be mirrored by an understanding of how these models work, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'd echo what the other two panelists say. So, yeah, in my work, and especially when I talk about disinformation, it makes it seem like I hate AI, but that's not the case. Um, AI being used in detection of disinformation, that's a fantastic use of the technology. It has other uses outside of disinformation, and that's fantastic. And also what Cecilia is talking about with democratization of information, I think is really important. I mentioned at the start that people are using this technology to ask about political information, about electoral candidates and everything. Um, it may provide inaccurate and biased information, of course, but it can provide information. So people are being able to actually talk to these models and ask them more complex questions and get a more detailed understanding of these topics. Um, and it may also offer people a way of articulating their own experiences, their own ideas in a much more detailed way when they maybe struggle with doing that. But I think the main point is just to caveat all that is that AI is not bad. It just needs to be managed properly. It needs to be understood properly. And we need to highlight the issues to people.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question, but let's do it rapid fire if possible. So maybe one or two sentences from each of you. We have an audience member, Nima, who's developing a research proposal in the field of disinformation, and she asks, given the panel's work on trust, information overload, and scale, is there any research that comes to mind? And maybe I'll just add, what are you reading now that you think our audience should be reading about AI, disinformation, trust, and the media landscape? Whoever wants to go first, maybe just one or two sentences. I realize you may need a moment to think.
And I've just been reading a paper by the Oxford Internet Institute about how AI can actually slowly change or through bias kind of mislead the information that you want to post online. I don't know if that directly relates to exactly what you're saying, but again, this kind of small psychological shifts in content through AI posting I was reading yesterday there was a report by um, Liberties about models, and when they were asked about the Hungarian elections a couple months ago, the type of content and the biases in their responses as well. So they're the two things that I've been reading over the last couple of days that might be interesting for any work on this kind of area.
Andrew?
I've not been reading anything recently because I've been on holiday. But I mean, the thing that pops to my mind immediately is it's not quite an old essay, but I think it's called Deepfakes and Epistemic Backstop, which is by philosopher Regina Rini. And basically, she goes into explaining um, the epistemic or the impact of AI on knowledge and how we form knowledge. And it's just a really good in-depth discussion of why AI is presenting a much more significant problem. It's not just a new version of Photoshop or whatever. So I would recommend that.
Cecile?
Yeah, so I would say that for me, the most important thing is to kind of read across fields. So even though I'm in psychology, I like to read work on philosophy and AI, sociology and AI, computer science and AI, etc., to understand both the kind of philosophical aspects, the psychological and the societal. In terms of specific work that I read, I follow Jay Van Bevel's work a lot at NYU, who does research on social identity and misinformation, alongside Steve Lewandowski at Bristol University, who does a lot of work on interventions and also the information landscape, as well as Mosen Mosley at the Oxford Internet Institute, who also has a lot of kind of model level research, which I think is really interesting to look at, and kind of combining those perspectives to understand how AI is impacting our information environment.
I think that's a great note to end on. So let me draw us to a close. I'd like to thank our excellent panel, Cecile Treyberg, Joshua Tyler, and Andrew McIntyre for their time and their clarity and their thoughts on these really dense and challenging issues. And I'd like to thank our audience and everyone who joined and participated in the discussion by sending in your questions. You really made this discussion more vibrant and more interesting for all of us involved. This was the first session of the CCOD summer webinar series. We'll be back with at least one more session on August 19th when we turn to disinformation and democracy. So we're switching the focus a little bit from AI to politics. Details and registration for this event will shortly be up on our website and social media channels, so do follow along. And if today's discussion is the kind of work you'd like to see more of, the CCOD is always glad to hear from policymakers, academics, students, and professionals in the field. Please get in touch. And finally, a recording of today, as well as video highlights and a short written summary, will be shared soon on the CCOD's media channels. Until next time, thank you. Thank you to our panelists, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.